Hi everyone, I didn't record the beginning of the session, so I just wanted to quickly introduce it for you before you go on and watch it if you're interested. So, my name is Lily. I am a postgraduate student of environmental protection and management at the University of Edinburgh. And this webinar is part of a webinar series called Dear Politicians, where we will discuss the importance of interdisciplinary collaborations in the environmental crisis and how eco-poetry, arts can actually help tackling it. And today's session uh, will be an introduction to poetry, eco-poetry, and the environmental crisis in general with two incredible speakers, Andrew McMillan and Dr. Hannah Grist, where Andrew McMillan is an award-winning poet and senior lecturer at the Manchester Metropolitan University. And unfortunately, he was not able to attend today's session as last minute he had to go for work trip. So he was so kind to actually pre-record his talk. So I hope you will enjoy it. And then we will have Hannah Grist, who is a marine ecologist and a lecturer at SRUC and the University of Edinburgh. And apart from being an incredible scientist, she's interested in the collaborations between art and science, and she will tell you more about that. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and I hope to see you next week for our next one.
Hi everybody, my name is Andrew McMillan and I'm a poet. I'm based here at Manchester Metropolitan University and I'm really thrilled to be asked to come along and do a little bit of a talk for you today. I'm sorry that it's not live, but I'm afraid that I'm travelling on the day that I think you're actually watching this, and so I've had to pre-record it, but I've got some questions that have already been asked and I'm going to say a little bit broadly about kind of how I view eco poetry as well. Thank you very much to Lily for asking me to do this. I had the honour of teaching Lily at undergraduate and to kind of witness what I think were the beginnings of this Dear Politicians project and the eco poetry project, which you're going to hear more about over the coming sessions. And so it's really, really lovely to be back and to be contributing my little bit to this thinking that is being done. As I'm preaching to the converted, I know, but eco poetry has never been so important. I guess one of the first things that might come up for us is, well, what is an eco poem? Is that different to just a poem that looks at nature? Eco poetry has many different definitions, and many more people much smarter than me will no doubt be able to explain those to you, and may well explain those to you as you go through the different sessions over the coming weeks. But eco poetry essentially tends to be um, poetry that I suppose looks at nature but has a design on us as well, has something it wants to say, so kind of has that political message. And then you get into kind of aesthetic debates basically about, well, what is political poetry? Isn't all poetry political? All those kind of things. But we might think of eco poetry as something that is interested, as I say, in the landscape, but also has something to say, has an argument to make to us about that landscape, about how we might protect it. And given that, we know after the COP conference this last year and the growing climate emergency that is should be at the forefront of all our minds across the world, the eco poetry feels perhaps as though it's never been more important. Poetry, there are two ways of looking at this, I think. On one level, poetry is not, any art is not a substitute for legislative change. And so, what we need in order to combat the climate emergency are aggressive and far reaching and the necessary kind of legislation to be passed by various governments and world bodies around the globe. So, art and poetry aren't substitutes for legislative change. But what they can do is perhaps reach further than a politician's words might, because poetry is often based on a distillation of message. because it comes at things at a slant angle, because poetry finds new ways to say things, and because poetry, more than anything, I often think, it makes us pay attention. Poetry, one of the great things that any art can do, and particularly poetry, I think, is that we read a poem and the world is somehow changed from how it was before. So if I read a poem about a snail, I might think of Tom Gunn's Considering the Snail, Olive Senior's fantastic poem Gastropoda. I read those poems, and afterwards I can't look at a snail the same way as I did before. My mindset is slightly changed. And so poetry, like any great art, has that ability to make us refocus, to make us pay attention. Because poetry asks of us, even very short poems, ask of us a different kind of attention. You can't scroll past it. You can't flick through it. Poems, even a couple of lines of poetry, ask of us a slowing down and a paying of attention. And in that way, poetry is perhaps uniquely placed to make people sit up, take notice, to make people pay attention to what is happening. It's not just a topic, I guess, is one of the other things that I would say about eco poetry. About, it's not just a topic that one might write a poem about. In many ways, we're perhaps moving to a place where all poems need to in some way be eco poems, that all poems need to somehow be engaged with the ecological collapse and the climate emergency that is all around us. And for the young writers and newer writers that are perhaps listening to this, that's something to maybe think about, isn't it? How is your poetry in conversation with that topic of global importance? The other thing to say as well is, obviously, I'm a white cis man. I live in the Western world. The effects of climate change that we're already seeing, and the effects, the devastating impact of the climate emergency that we're going to see over the next decade or so, are going to impact global majority countries much more than they impact me and my life. And so when we're thinking about what poetry to read, what poetry to centre, whose voices to hear from, I think it's really vital that we push ourselves to centre the voices of First Nations people, of Indigenous people, of people from geographical locations that were on the front line of this emergency, and to really kind of centre their voices, not write or speak over them. Eco poetry is an interesting thing for me to talk about, I guess, because I've never thought of myself as an eco poet. As I say, I learned a lot from Lily when Lily was doing the project with us here at Manchester Met, and kind of writing in different ways about ecological collapse and the climate emergency and eco poetry more broadly. I felt like I learned a lot from that. It's never been something that I have consciously thought is at the centre of my practice, but more and more, I think, as I was saying earlier, more and more I begin to think, well, surely poetry in some way has to be in conversation with this thing. Even if my topic normally is the body and masculinity and those kind of ideas, well, surely my work somehow is still kind of touching on this idea. Because as I say, it's not a separate kind of siphoned off thing. It affects everything. It's about to begin to affect everything over the coming decade. And therefore, what does that mean for poetry? If this thing is infusing every part of our lives, what does that mean for poetry and for writing and art more broadly as well, I think? As with any poetry, writing about these huge subjects is really hard. And I don't mean that glibly, and that's not just because I'm not the best poet in the world, though that also is true. It's that when we come to write about these huge subjects, they can often be really difficult to tackle because they're so broad, because they're so vast. And so if I wanted to write a poem about an entire landscape, or about the climate emergency, or about a particular incident, these things are often so vast. How does one get that onto the page? How does one kind of pay attention to that and do it any kind of justice? And so often what we have to do, and often what most poetry is built on, is this idea of synecdoche. So an idea of the kind of part that represents the whole. And that's how most poetry works, right? If I want to write a poem about masculinity, I don't try and write about the entire kind of masculine race of the entire world. What I try and do is write about my own body or the body of one particular person that I might have observed, and then you use that to extrapolate outwards. So the question that we often ask about poetry, or should ask about poetry, I guess, is not what it means, but what's behind it. So why am I being shown this thing? And so if I'm shown one part of the landscape, if I'm shown one memory or one incident, it's not necessarily because that moment or incident or thing, that object, that tree, that river, that stream is the most important thing in the world. It's because those things speak outward. Those things can represent. There's a great quote by a poet called Peter Sansom, who I really admire, and he has this great quote in a book about writing that he put together, where he says, "If you try and write about the meaning of life, you'll probably come up against a brick wall. But if you write about the brick wall, you might say something about the meaning of life." And it's a pithy little quote, but really it's getting at the heart of that thing, which is, how do you want to show what it is you want to say? So, there are different types of writing, aren't there? There's rhetorical writing, there's political speech, there is journalism, there are kind of opinion columns. Poetry kind of sits outside of all that. It does not say that poetry isn't inherently political, which is not to say that eco-poetry can't carry its argument and its message within the body of the poem, but it's thinking about how that's portrayed to the reader and how that's given. And one of the challenges you might set yourself or want to think about as a poet, as a writer, is what can I show the reader to highlight this particular thing that I feel is important and needs to be highlighted. As I say, it's an odd thing for me to perhaps to be talking about because I'm not an eco poet at heart, though I do is something that obviously I feel is very important and that I enjoy reading. One of the really interesting things is to go back to poets of old, as it were, and begin to try and think of them as eco-poets. One of the great things that Lily wrote for us when she was at university was an essay about Ginsberg and the kind of qualities of Allen Ginsberg and contemporary and modern kind of eco-poetry and eco-thought. And that's really interesting, that it isn't just the kind of work that's produced now, it's perhaps going back and rereading and thinking about these other poets with a kind of different lens, I think. And so there were some questions that I know that Lily kind of put out a call on Instagram and said that I was recording this video and you all had some kind of questions that you wanted me to answer and to think about. So I'm going to do my best to just go through a few of them now. And the most common one that Lily tells me that was asked is this one of how to overcome writer's block. So writer's block, it means something different to different people, right? For some people, it can be that you have something specific you need to write to, so a kind of deadline, or you've got a specific task, and the brain is just kind of blocking you getting there, which can often be a kind of symptom of various kind of mental health conditions, right? So anxiety or depression can kind of stop you doing the thing that you know you need to do. I think more broadly, writer's block, it tends to be around this idea of you have a vague sense of what it is you should or want to write, and you just don't know quite how to get there. I think the first thing to say is that writing sometimes goes away, and the only thing you can do is trust that it will come back at some point. That's of no use to people that have university deadlines and kind of things to meet. But if you don't, if you have the luxury of not having to write to a particular deadline, you have to trust that it will come back, and it will. I've never written every day. I'm in awe of people that can, but it's never something that I've been able to do. And for me, sometimes writing goes away for weeks or for months. And I always think that's fine because that's me replenishing myself. That's me getting ready for when the kind of words come back. And the thing that I always go back to in those moments is reading. I always think, I only write because I love to read. I only write because I really love reading. And so every time the writing kind of dries up or it goes away for a little while, I go back to reading. I try and read new things. I try and read work that I know will challenge me. I try to read work by poets who maybe aren't my cup of tea or that I don't particularly enjoy the style of because I want to be challenged. And in that challenge and in that reading, you're replenishing yourself. And I think also it's about kind of surprising the self. There's no way to talk about this that isn't pretentious, I guess. But I always think you have to kind of simply put yourself out in the world in a way that invites poetry to kind of happen. And that might be kind of walking a different way home from work, getting off the bus one stop early, watching an odd film that you might never have chosen to watch, reading that book that you might not have chosen to read, inhabiting the world and trying to sort of surprise yourself, and see new things. And I think that once you inhabit the world in that way, you just begin to notice things, and it's that quality of noticing, of paying attention, that is really important, especially when the work isn't there. Um, the other day I was walking to the tram and I saw it was snowing. It was weirdly snowing. It's been this kind of weird kind of time, climate breakdown and all that, where it's been hot and then it's been snowing. And I was walking to the tram and it was snowing, but the first blossom was already coming off the trees and it was quite windy. And so there was this weird moment where there was both kind of blossom falling to the ground, but also snow. And I just noticed that and found that quite interesting. So I made a note on my phone. And that might become something, it might not become something, but I've got that there. And I'm not going to try and force it. I'm just going to carry that image around with me for a little bit and see if that happens. See what can become of that. But I only got to that moment of noticing that because I was in the world in a way that hopefully meant that I could pay attention and that I was kind of open to things happening. So I think, in terms of how to overcome writer's block, trust that it will come back, that block will pass, and just try and be open to surprising yourself with different media, with as I say, moving around your home or the place where you live in a slightly different way. Anything that kind of arrests the mundanity of the everyday will always eventually feed back, I think, into your writing. Another question that was asked was, humans are deeply connected to nature, which is very true. And do you think poetry has a significant role in the environmental crisis? Well, as I was saying at the start, in many ways I might already have answered partly this one. Poetry in any art cannot be, it would seem to me, a substitute for legislative change and for legislative protection of anybody or of the planet. Do you know what I mean? The me writing a poem is not going to solve anything. It's going to be a move towards a carbon neutral, greener economy, in theory. You know what I mean? So partly there's that. But what I do think that, as I said before, what I do think that poetry in any art does is that poetry focuses the mind. Poetry highlights things. Poetry points things out that we might otherwise miss. And poetry, through its distillation and its kind of crystallizing of language, makes us pay attention, and it draws attention to things, and it celebrates things as well as mourning them, as well as thinking about loss. Poetry is also a beautiful kind of way of celebrating things. And so in that way, poetry has a really vital role to play, I think, in the environmental crisis, both in chronicling it, so both as poetry as witness. If you think about history in classrooms, when you study history in school, one of the main things that you might do is look at writing of the time to find out what people really thought. And so if you're writing a poem about what it is to exist now in this period of environmental catastrophe and collapse, that's the history that hopefully kids in 50, 60 years might be studying. So one of your roles as a writer, as a poet, is to be a poet of witness, is to pay attention and bear witness to what is happening around you. But the other side of that is perhaps more active, which is that poetry does have an ability to draw and focus the mind, to make people concentrate, and maybe to point out things that otherwise might have gone missing. Someone's asked me if I do any research prior to writing, which is a really good question. So often it depends. So for prose, yes. For either essays or for kind of fiction prose, yes, I kind of do research and then try and smooth that into the body of the work. But for poetry, I tend not to do any specific research for the poem I'm kind of working on. It tends to be that I'm just a bit of a magpie and I kind of love reading stuff. So if I'm reading a non-fiction book about, just reading Amitav Ghosh's beautiful book, a really quite harrowing book about the kind of effects of colonialism and narratives around that. And somehow just odd phrases from that book might jump out at me, and I'll remember them when I go on to do something else. I remember once reading about when statues, this is an odd one to say, but when statues are kind of thought to be crying, when people kind of have these interactions with statues, with religious iconography, and they feel as though the religious statue is crying, the thinking behind that is because God has entered the statue. So God is present in the statue, and that's why it's weeping. Um, and I just remember reading that fact in something, an article or a newspaper or something like that. And then years later, it turned up in a poem. And so I don't think that I'm not actively researching and then moving on to write, but your whole existence is research, isn't it? Everything is research. Everything you read, everything you consume and watch, every conversation you have is research that then will at some point, subconsciously or consciously, begin to feed itself into the poem. So I think that is that's kind of my approach to it. Some people do research much more, and that's because they're writing very specific things. So they might be working in an archive. I think of Jay Bernard's brilliant work about the New Crossfire, and they worked in an archive, for instance, for a while kind of collating and thinking about that work. So oftentimes kind of archival and more more kind of down the line, I guess, kind of research is necessary. But for me, as I say, I often think about just living as research, kind of existence as research, and doing the kind of having the experience, having the thought, and then using the poem later on, kind of later down the line, as a means to process what's happened. Somebody has asked your poetry, so my poetry feels very personal and emotional. How do you evoke the same emotion in the reader? That's a really good question. And I'm not sure. You hope that you do. All that you can ever do, I think the only way to do it is to be as honest as possible on the page. And that doesn't mean the what actually happened truth. There's a great quote I love by Rita Ann Higgins, Irish poet, who said, to get to the poetic truth, it's not always necessary to tell the what actually happened truth, and these times I lie. And I love that idea that there might be a what actually happened truth and a poetic truth. So the way that I think about it is that nothing in my life has ever happened to me as a poem. Life would be easier if it happened as a poem, right? But life doesn't have line breaks and stanzas and cadence and meter. Life is messier and more difficult than that. And so to make something a poem is already to make it false slightly, is already to lie. And so beyond that, it's just a matter of degrees. But what you're always searching for is the kind of poetic truth of the moment. And so in terms of how you kind of communicate that to a reader, I've always just tried to be as sincere and as truthful, as honest with myself as possible. Someone else might write a poem about the same incident and have an entirely different thought about it, which is fine. All I can do is pay close and sincere attention to how I think something was or something happened, and also to feel it. I think that the poems, so the way I might think about it, I guess, is the poems that have that kind of impact on me, the poems where I feel the emotion kind of transfer by osmosis from the poet, from the page to me, is that it feels as though they felt that as they wrote it. So there's that great Robert Frost quote, right, where, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader, no laughter in the writer, no laughter in the reader. I've messed that up, but it's something along those lines. So this idea that unless you feel it as you write it, how would that transfer to the reader? So if it matters to you, if it matters deeply to you and you feel that as you're creating the work, then the reader will be able to feel that as well, I think. So that to me is always the key. Someone asked what my favourite poem of my own is. I daren't answer that because that's a scary question to answer. But they asked if I can read or talk about it. I mean, I guess I can say something about my work more broadly, which is, as I said at the start, like I'm interested in ideas about masculinity, about sexuality, about violence, about the bodies of men, and I guess how all those things interact with each other. I think talking about your own work is often quite odd because you have your idea for it, but then somebody else comes along and they might read it entirely differently, or they bring themselves to it, which is what you always want, again, from art, from anything like that, isn't it? That it exists, but there's space for you to step into it and for you to have your own thought about it. And that's a really important thing to bear in mind. I never, a lot of the things that are said about my work, if you Google me, a poet of northern masculinity, a poet of the queer body, whatever it is, I never set out to do any of those things. I never set out to be any of those things. I just wrote the poetry that occurred to me at the time. I just wrote the poetry that I felt I needed to write. And everything else is for other people to put onto it. I think everything else is interpretation. It's for a critic or a publisher or a reader to kind of bring that to it. And I think that that's important to bear in mind when we think about eco poetry as well, to kind of circle back to that eco poetry and the subject of the environment more broadly is such a huge thing. No one poem can contain all that. You have your sensibility, you have your way of looking at the world, you have your point of view, and you have your experience. How do you bring that to bear on the page? That's all that matters. You cannot contain an entire movement or an entire argument or world within one poem. You can just write the poem that you can write, and readers and critics and publishers and whoever it is will find themselves in it. So I hope that's been useful. And that's just some introductory thoughts, really. I think the seminar series that you're signed up to and that you're going to be a part of is going to be really exciting. And Lily will be a great guide for you over the coming weeks. So thank you very much for listening. If you've got any more questions, things that I've not quite answered or you want me to expand on, just let Lily know and I'll answer those afterwards. So don't worry about that and enjoy the rest of the sessions as well.
Andrew's really inspirational talk. That was fantastic to hear. And there's a few things I'd like to pick up on there. As you said, my name's Hannah. I'm a lecturer at SRUC Edinburgh and deputy director of a course called Environmental Management Protection, which we run at the University of Edinburgh. And we have postgrads come from all over the world to Edinburgh to learn and discuss and kind of take action on how we can think about or improve, hopefully, the environmental crises we find ourselves in. And although it can be a very challenging course, looking at some very big issues, it's certainly a real joy for me to meet and work with all these dedicated kind of young people, and some not so young people, and the work they're doing. So I want to start off again, I think, by saying congratulations and thanks to Lily for organising events like this one, and in particular bringing, I think, very unique knowledge and expertise to creating these kind of important interdisciplinary conversations. So I'm going to start with a disclaimer in that I am not a poet, professional or otherwise. So any in-depth poetry questions, I'm glad Andrew's already tackled them as to how you would write that. But what I am here to do is to give the perspective of a scientist, an environmentalist, and someone that is passionate about that intersection between art and science and the importance of it for dealing with our environmental crises. So I'm a scientist. I think incredible scientist might be a step too far, but I appreciate the gesture. And in fact, it's a really interesting position for me to find myself in because, in all honesty, I never wanted to be a scientist. I never wanted to be an academic. I probably call myself accidental academic. In particular, from a young age, I've been deeply passionate about reading, creative writing, particularly short stories. And Andrew saying that he only writes because he loves to read really resonates with me. Reading is a passion that has never gone away, as you might be able to see from the room behind me. I'm going to say that I never had the bravery to write poetry, particularly. I've always found it a phenomenal art form, but the kind of stripped back nature of it and that kind of raw emotion and actually quite intense technicality of writing that, I think make you quite vulnerable when you're writing it. And for me, it's always been easier to hide my shortcomings as an artist in stories. So I'm in nothing but awe from people that manage to actually write poetry. So all my life, my kind of two areas of happiness or contentment, I guess, have been reading and writing and walking and being outdoors. And so I kind of had two very opposite paths that I could have chosen in life. And for very many years, my path was always going to be to go to university, to read English, to find a way to work creatively, to write about what I was passionate about. But I grew up in that period post the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, when I think environmentalism was rising on the agenda. where climate change became a term that was known outside of science circles, and worse for me, where the term biodiversity always began to be followed by the word crisis rather than anything more positive. And in that atmosphere, to focus on reading and creative writing, for me, felt like an abdication of responsibility. It felt like a privilege that I couldn't afford at that time. And I've had these conversations with people. One of my friends is actually writing a show for the Edinburgh Fringe this year. She's a comic. And we've had these conversations about how can you sit down and feel like you can write comedy in a world where you're surrounded by stories of poverty and war. I'm going to come back to that point. But because of that, I went on to study science. So I've worked in universities and charities and conservation organizations. I've done activism, environmentalism, and mainly I've spent time talking to our policymakers and colleagues and the public about science, about climate change, about biodiversity. And my life has really been about then finding facts, analyzing facts, sharing facts, and hoping that, I guess, the stark, brutal truth of the troubles we face are a sufficient motivation for change. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the environmental crisis. So I do have some facts for you. In my previous role, I worked as part of a large consortium of scientists trying to understand and model climate change in the Arctic region. And one of the standard facts we used to use there is that the Arctic is warming twice as fast as anywhere else on the planet. Now, in the last few years, that's actually been found to be an underestimate. I would say it's warming maybe 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet. And not only is that a kind of terrifying thing to absorb, but I think understanding that the planet is this huge churning circulatory system of water and air, and it carries heat to the north. So, you know, I think an important part of climate change is where we feel the impacts is not where we've created the impacts, right? So some of you may have seen in the news that the Arctic was 30 degrees above normal temperatures a few weeks ago. And that is freakish, extreme temperatures that we can directly trace back to climate change and anthropogenic climate change. But that's not just a kind of remote headline grabbing figure. I'm sat here right now, I live just outside Edinburgh, and Arctic warming directly affects my experiences living here. So the more it warms and causes ice melt in the Arctic, the more these normal patterns of air circulation and water circulation disrupted and changed. And we can scientifically link directly those changes to increased extremes here in Europe, from heat waves that sit over the continent for days or weeks at a time to these kind of violent winter storms and flooding. And that's just, you know, one example from my experience of the crisis that we face. I know many of you will have been seeing the latest iteration of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the IPCC report out recently. It's an amazing piece of work, amazing example of scientific knowledge and cooperation, but it paints a very stark picture. You know, some of the headline figures are around, to achieve our aim of 1.5 degree warming, we have to reduce CO2 emissions by 50% in the next 80 years. And, you know, that's not even mentioning methane emissions and everything else we're doing. And so the analysis is that our current policies are putting us on track for 3 degrees of warming in the coming decades, if we do nothing else. Now, the reason we weren't terribly keen on hearing that we were coming towards 3 degrees of warming is that that is catastrophic. That's major cities flooded by sea level rise, entire areas of the world becoming uninhabitably hot, wars over water and food, mass migration, accelerated biodiversity loss. I think Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, recently said, basically, the world is on a fast track to climate disaster. So that's probably not news. That's the thing. That's not new information to people like you that are coming and to these kind of events and listening to these webinars. And in fact, if you are anything like most of the people I speak to, you're probably almost numb to that sheer unbelievable scale and severity of a problem, and your incapacity, my incapacity to feel like you can affect change. And I guess the other perfectly normal reaction is grief. Grief for polar bears and pandas, but grief for what your life and your kids' lives and the lives of strangers living halfway around the world are and are going to be. Okay, I've done my bit. I've made, I think, I've taken the words of others and said, this is pretty stark. If you want to know more about the climate crisis, if you want to step up and face the facts, there are references, there are articles everywhere. You can't avoid the information, the very good, brilliant scientific information that's out there. And I think understanding the science and stepping up to face that reality is important. But what I found over time is it's not enough, and it's not even necessarily the most important part. I think understanding what to do in the face of that reality is probably more important, and that's where the real challenge is. So what was nice for me reading the IPCC report is that the recommendations are stark, but they do start talking about what we need to do to affect change. And some of them are big scale, but on principle, they're simple. So the first one is no more fossil fuels, just no excuses, no exceptions, right? And that is a problem of infrastructure and taxes and levies and planning, and that is not a problem necessarily for you and me. That's a politician's problem, right? Hello, dear politicians. This is your problem, please solve it. The current IPCC report also says that simply stopping emissions is not going to be enough to avoid runaway climate change. We need to find ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So that's a huge problem, but that's a scientific problem. That's an engineering problem. That's a point where we need to find technological fixes to step up. One of the big differences with this report is that it actually features, I guess, cultural and social science aspects of it. And it talks about how we need to change how we interact with the world, how we value nature, how we understand waste, how we get around, how we eat, our kind of wider society, and how we live on this planet. Now that is a cultural problem. And that, I think, is why 16-year-old me was completely wrong on many things, but particularly this one, to think that making art in the face of the environmental crisis was somehow unnecessary or frivolous. Because our arts, our painting, our poetry are integral in helping us face up to that reality and in taking action. So in my role as a scientist, my role as an environmentalist, there are lots of ways that I have been able to see eco art, like eco poetry, make a difference around the work we're doing and around the environment. And I think, and Andrew picked this out really nicely in that, poetry is a way of making us look at things in a different way, or bringing it to us in a way that feels very personal. So one of the ways is that we can use it to overcome that numbness. We can find it a way to look at a future differently, either a dystopian future that we hope not to see, or a positive future that we want to work towards. So someone who works at an organization called Tipping Point, it's a fantastic organization that connects arts and sciences together, Peter Grunwald, he said one of his dreams was to inspire a work so powerful that it provides the impetus to action without that having to happen in real life, without millions of people losing their lives. It can be done through art alone. And I've seen that happen. I've seen some amazing artists working with people. I've had the real privilege to work with an artist called Eve Mosher in New York, who undertook a project called High Water Line, where she used essentially like a football grounds line drawing machine to draw a high water line around the whole of New York. She walked through neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Manhattan. And she drew that line where sea level rise, if we didn't do anything, is predicted to end up. And that was through neighborhoods and schools and businesses and right through communities. And she used that as a conversation to connect with people and to bring to life what would have been a very dry scientific prediction to people and their actual day-to-day lives. So arts can do that. They can show us the future, what it might be, or what we hope it won't be. It can also be a real inspiration, a call to arms through emotion. Again, Andrew mentioned something about poetry involving us slowing down to engage with it. You can't, like flick like you would through Twitter through a poem. And so it's uniquely placed for us to sit up and pay attention. And in that way, it's a really powerful tool of activism. And in particular, I think, importantly, an inclusive tool of activism in a way that perhaps scientists particularly and the environmentalists have been quite poor at over quite a long period of time. So there are studies that show obviously that climate change is going to affect the poorest communities, and there's no solution to climate change that does not involve bringing those communities in and around social and environmental justice. So some of our projects find ways to use art to engage with these communities. And we can look at the science behind that. Actually, art brings in people of color, they bring in people, young people, they bring in more women, because there's more of a connection there beyond the kind of like exclusive hierarchies and power structures that we have created around decision making at the moment. It finds a way to bridge that and overcome it. And I think we underestimate the power of art. We were having this discussion in class a few weeks ago, and one of our students was talking about a project that used children's art on bike lanes. So turn the bike lanes into art projects essentially. And that actually increased people's uses of bikes. So not just children, everyone. And that's because people of all ages want to get out to see unicorns and Darth Vader on bike paths, something they would miss in a car. And I think what's key about that is that people respond more readily to hopeful artistic experiences than they do to even financial incentives. It speaks to us more and what we want to be as humans. I think finally, it's difficult to avoid cliches talking about art and environment, right? But things like poetry particularly can bring us together to share ideas and process that grief. Right? I think Andrew used the term a distillation of connection and loss. I actually wrote it down because I was like, that's fantastic. I'm stealing it. And I certainly would argue that poetry has the capacity to do that more than any other art form, which is strange in a way, because I think poetry is something you often experience or read alone, but has that kind of very raw emotional connection to others, even if they're not happen to be in the room with you. So there was a poll on social media last year about the poetry you need right now. I'm not suggesting I get all my research from social media, but sometimes it gives you a snapshot of what people are thinking. And one of the poems that came out on top that really interested me was Wendell Berry's Into the Peace of Wild Things. So it's a classic piece of nature writing, I guess, about being out in nature and the inner peace that brings to you, particularly of being around things that can't feel the grief that you might be feeling. And as a scientist, as an environmental activist, that actually brings me intense hope that this is the poetry that people are picking. This is the things they're coming back to again and again. They want to think about that connection with nature and what they can do differently. And I think that's an amazing thing to see, that people feel that connection so deeply through something like poetry. So as scientists, we're increasingly aware that the answers are not science-based, or they're not solely science-based, right? And we're increasingly trying to reach out to our colleagues in the arts to work together, particularly to kind of, I guess, stand up and face together the climate and biodiversity crisis, because nothing is going to be solved by one approach. So I've recently had the opportunity to work with organisations like Creative Carbon Scotland, who bring together creative practitioners and scientists and building a network of solidarity and shared understanding. I'm just finishing a project with an organisation called MASTS, Eco Art Scotland and Creative Informatics, where we work directly with scientists and artists around ocean issues. Now, it was interesting for me, because this was a bit of like a pilot as to how we could make this work. We put out an open call for artists, right? We didn't have an idea of what we wanted. We were open to creative practitioners telling us that. And interestingly, to my knowledge, we didn't have a single poet respond, right? Lots of visual artists, lots of sound artists, not a single poet. And I don't know why that is. Maybe someone can tell me in the chat or the questions afterwards. Because I think as environmentalists and scientists, we're crying out for people that can do this, that have these skills and the passion and want to work in this arena. And I think there are people like me, like us out there. I think there are opportunities, and we need things like poetry to be involved. And I think I've been speaking to some communities recently, the work we've been doing. A lot of people say, oh, we're quite intimidated by working with scientists. Which, I mean, the idea that anyone is intimidated by me is hilarious, first off. But I think I wanted to pick up on one of Andrew's last points. I think, you know, beyond being scientists or poets or anything, we're all just seeking some kind of truth, some kind of communication, some way to try and make sense of our experience of the world, whether that's through scientific research or through poetry. And I think there's more in common with us trying to face this environmental issue than there are in the differences in the ways we're approaching it. Which is all to say, please reach out to us. Please, let's find ways of working together, because I think we're more effective when we do things together across disciplines. Now, I haven't been keeping on the time. I don't want to talk much longer, but I did want to say that I was at events for COP26 through in Glasgow last year, and we had speeches from politicians and speeches from activists and speeches from scientists, right? So many speeches. But the only time I was at an event where I saw people genuinely emotional and a couple of people in tears, other than David Attenborough speaking, which is an entire category of itself, so we don't count that, right? Was when I was at a post-conference event and someone read out a poem called about the Clyde, the River Clyde in Glasgow, written by Scotland's national poet, Kathleen Jamie the Macker. And so I'll pop that up because I'd like you to take that time to read that or listen to it at the end, because I think she pretty much says, I think, what we all wanted to say at that moment. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks, Lily.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was amazing. You mentioned so many interesting points that I wanted to touch upon, but I would like to first, give other people the chance to ask you any questions, or if they have anything again that they disagreed with what you said or agreed with, or if you didn't depress us too much, and people will actually have the energy. So if anyone has any questions, you can just unmute yourself and ask. If not, I have many.
I have a question. Andrew mentioned that good poetry, or not even good poetry, just poetry in general, takes time and involves the process of like stepping back and slowing down. But at the same time, Hannah, you quoted Antonio Gutierrez, who said that we are on the fast track towards an ecological disaster, and that we need to act as fast as we can, and that our time frame to avoid like the big catastrophes like super, super small. So what would you say, either of you, I mean, Lily, you might be able to answer that as well. What would you say, like, how is that combinable? How can we like combine slowing down for poetry and like acting fast for climate change?
Did you want to take this one, Hannah?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. Thank you for an incredibly challenging question. That really kicks it off on a good level. I think it's a really good point, and quite often I think in our kind of environmental activism, we hit these kind of paradoxes or these dichotomies, right? That, you know, the change we need to see is huge and transformative, but it also needs to happen now. And I think we are in a difficult stage now where 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we had time to sit and think about things deeply. And now we're at the point where actually, you know, there is no, I think the IPCC is very clear that there is no point to sit down and read things. I guess the advantage of poetry is that it's short, right? The time to take and think about it is not that in depth. But I think, joking aside, they are playing slightly different roles. So I think poetry has an opportunity for people that are currently overwhelmed with the sheer pace of everything that's happening in life right now. So the trouble with the environmental crisis, and particularly what we found over like COVID, is that that's a very immediate problem, right? That's a kind of something that people need to deal with now. And now we're talking about cost of living crisis, and that's what people need to deal with now. And so the environment gets lost almost because it's so not slow moving, but such a huge thing that we just see as this stationary object that we live upon, rather than this kind of like, you know, I need food, I need to deal with these crises now. And so I think actually poetry gives us a chance to, or eco poetry gives us a chance to find stasis in the middle of all the other crises that are clamoring for our attention. And I think that's a really nice way for us to connect to the environment particularly. But I also do completely agree that there are, you know, challenges between these two messages. And obviously, you know, we need people to be connecting with these things, but also to see that that connection needs to lead immediately to some kind of change, and not just think of the environment as this thing that will always be there and that we can think about later.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said, but I just wanted to add that there are multiple different styles within eco poetry itself. So you have, you know, eco poetry that's more pro movement, preaching eco poetry and just actually calling people to action, which then this poetry, in my opinion, should be very fast, quick moving, reacting to immediate change. However, if you are using eco poetry as a way to deal with your, you know, climate anxiety, or you want to connect with other people who may feel the same way, I feel like for it to be effective, it should be well thought of and primary, you know, for you to personally understand your feelings, how they're affected by, you know, climate change and all of those things that's happening around us. So then for this type of poetry, you need time to actually first understand your own feelings so you can share it with broader audience and, you know, connect on that level with other people.
Thank you so much. And can I just really quickly follow up on what you just said, Lily? Maybe it's a stupid question, I don't know, but would you say that some forms of eco poetry are more effective or should be paid more attention to when we want to use eco poetry to make change? Or would you say they're all equally important and equally effective? I'm not an eco poet, so I don't really know, but would be interesting to hear what you think about that.
Okay, that's another brilliant question and quite hard question to answer. I don't think anything is equally important, but at the same time it is. It doesn't really answer your question, but in some way it depends what you want to get out of it, I would say. So it depends on the aim of the poem, what is your intention with it, and how do you want people to react. And I think if people are reacting, you know, to your personal poem that's more in, you know, emotional level, it would be effective in long term, I would say, more than immediate eco poetry that's reacting to immediate threats, if that makes any sense. I feel like they both have impacts, but on different levels for different groups and for different purposes. But at the end of the day, they still focus on, you know, the environmental crisis, and they still do their best to promote sustainability, promote better living for our planets, etc.
Thank you. That was a really good answer, actually.
Thank you. Does anyone else have another question?
I have a bit of a half-baked one. Just around, I found especially interesting the idea about, art and poetry making these issues more accessible to people. I think that's really powerful and something that I hadn't, I guess, fully considered before. I'm coming from an area of sort of science-based and facts-based, kind of similar to sort of what Hannah was saying around. That's usually the persuasive tools that we employ to convince people or get people engaged. And I think art is really interesting and another way to do that. My question then is just, I guess, how does that work in practice when we're talking about emotions? A lot of, if we're trying to if it's a call to action, or if it's if we're trying to educate people or start conversations, I guess each of those, a different kind of art might be more suitable to do each of those things. And I guess within a scientific sort of campaign or trying to change the way we think, you might want, I just see like a disconnect between art being an expression of self and maybe the needs of a project or a campaign or spreading knowledge being sort of specific to that instance. So yeah, again, I don't have a question formulated, but I guess how do we match up artists with these goals? If either of you wants to comment on that, we're happy to keep explaining, trying to figure out what I mean exactly.
I can probably talk a little bit to that actually, because it's something that we have been thinking about in some of the projects I've been working on. So coming in as scientists, right, we've got like, this is a project I would quite like the public to know this point. How could you use your creative practice to get this out to the public, please? And it's been quite a learning journey for us to work with artists who are kind of like, I'm not a communication medium, that's not my purpose. It's not just this taking your science and making it prettier or rhyme to get out to the public. And I think what increasingly we're doing now effectively as scientists is recognizing that we need to design these kind of these projects without so much of an end goal. So what we're trying not to do is be like, we have a science project, let's tack an artist on who can help us, right? It's like, for its own sake, how can we as scientists work with artists, and whatever the output is going to be stronger than any of us would happen in the first place. And so what we've been trying to do is kind of have scientists in conversation with artists, and then everyone's changed by that conversation. So it's not about an output, it's about how everyone's kind of lived experience alters from that interaction. And then if people want to take that either into their science or into their art and use that, then that's fantastic. But it's not like we've got like a deliverable at the end that we're keen on getting that outcome. Maybe Lily, you want to talk as the actual kind of artist in this relationship?
I feel like you actually answered the question brilliantly. Don't you think, Brady? I'm not sure if that's exactly what you wanted to hear, but from my perspective, it would be basically the same answer. And I'm glad that Hannah took it, as she has much more experience in, dealing with communities and different groups of people. So thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we ran out of time already. Thank you so much for everyone for joining. If you have any more questions for Hannah or for me or for Andrew, just keep in touch with me. I will also post all of important links on the website if you want to have a look about the things that we discussed, some incredible artists all around the world that could probably answer your question and motivate you to use art and eco-poetry more specifically. I just wanted to quickly talk about next week as well. When next week we'll have a guest from Poets for the Planet, which is organizations that actually participated in COP26, which is a big organization of poets, and their co-founder Ian McLachlan will talk about, eco-poetry and the movement. So this was more like introduction. So if you still have many questions about how effective eco-poetry can be, come to next session, as well as we will have Catherine Gamble, who is conservation officer at Marine Conservation Society. So if you want to join us, you can either scan the link that I'm just sharing or just go on the website and sign up for next week's webinar. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and Hannah, Andrew, amazing questions. So thank you so much. And again, if you want to keep in touch, join for next week, just sign up on the website or drop me an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily.
Bye.
Thanks, Lily.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye.